It's that time again. The annual conference of the American Society of Ag Consultants, otherwise known as ASAC, is going to be held in Fort Myers, Florida, this November 4th and 5th. Kurt Covington is one of 9 professionals who will address the conference. The other speakers who will cover a wide range of topics represent Florida Farm Bureau, Florida Citrus Commission, University of Tennessee Institute of Agriculture, National Ag Law Center, Risk Mitigators and Advisors, Tyler Associates, as well as the lead economist for dairy at CoBank, and myself, Chrissy Wozniak from North American Ag. The day and a half of presentations will be followed by ag tours on Tuesday afternoon at Echo Farms, one of my favorite places here in Fort Myers. Attendees will experience farming at its most creative, with unique demonstrations, plants, and techniques being used to help farmers and urban gardeners in developing countries. A second tour at Echo will showcase simple technologies that can improve food, water, and shelter for millions of people. A third tour of a hydroponic grower is also being planned. For more information and to register, visit www.agconsultants.org. That's www.agconsultants.org. See you there. With 2,000 plus attendees, 25 plus robots, and 60 plus exhibitors, FIRA USA is the best place in the world for meeting agricultural and ag robotics leaders and seeing the latest technology demonstrations. This unique 3-day event is being held in Salinas, California, September 19th to the 21st, 2023. Check out their new website at FIRA-USA.com. That's FIRA, FIRA-USA.com. Get registered today. I'm Chrissy Wozniak. My guest today has spent his life immersed in the world of agricultural economics. He served as presidential nominee on the board of the Federal Agricultural Mortgage Association, or Farmer Mac, where he served as chair of Audit. He teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in applied finance and financial modeling. He helps make crop insurance programs work better for producers across the U.S. Through Farmer Mac, he helps create and implement loan funding programs that increase farmers' access to capital. And he also helps build information systems for ag asset markets that utilize big data and novel computational strategies to better understand farmland values. He's going to be speaking in this year's Women in Agribusiness Summit in Nashville, Tennessee in September on the topic of U.S. farmland values. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. From Champaign, Illinois, I'd like to welcome Director of the TIAA Center for Farmland Research and Fruin Professor of Farmland Economics at the University of Illinois, Bruce Sherrick. Welcome, Bruce, and thank you so much for being here today.
No, thanks for having me.
So let's start out by telling us a bit about your background. Did you grow up in agriculture?
I did. I grew up on what, looking backwards, I view as one of the luckiest experiences possible. Grew up as a farm kid on a small farm in north central Ohio. And of course, I think a lot of farm kids grow up thinking, gosh, I have to work all the time and my friends maybe don't. But it turned out to be a great laboratory. My parents were very experimental. We had an early contract with Smuckers back when that was the thing, and grew every kind of imaginable crop, had livestock experiments, I'd say, so that each of us had to raise different things. So I had sheep and pigs and cattle and chickens and guineas at one point in time even. So it's a great background, and got my love of agriculture kind of started there.
Were your parents researchers?
No, well, my dad was, he was kind of that novel farmer teacher kind of guy, and he did a lot of experimental things, but it was just a place to raise a family and have a great life.
Amazing. I tried guinea hens once. I'm a chicken girl. I love chickens. I always have
Guineas
chickens.
are so loud.
They are, and they all got eaten by hawks. It was terrible. Oh. So I never tried them again. I don't know why hawks love them so much. I don't know. So what role does TIAA Center for Farmland Research play in supporting farmers and their financial management decisions?
So at the University of Illinois, we have a large project that I'll start with called FarmDoc. And FarmDoc Daily. FarmDoc Daily publishes essentially one original research element per day. And FarmDoc has a set of tools on it as well that producers or folks interested in agriculture, policymakers and so on, can use to assemble in one place a set of resources that we think of as being decision-centric. So if you have a question about policy or farm rents or farmland values or crop yields or, the farm bill debate that's going on, it tends to be kind of an informational clearinghouse. The TIAA Center is one element of that is focused on farmland values. And our tagline is advancing farmland markets through research and information. We also the TIAA Center supports a large portion of FarmDoc. And so we view that as just kind of a family of efforts, if you will, among the faculty here. But the center itself is kind of best described as being interested in anything that affects farmland values. So if it's interest rates or inflation or the greening of the energy supply in the US or crop insurance or the current weather, we tend to have an interest in it. We also track and work very closely with the Illinois Society of Farm Managers and Rural Appraisers to help with annual sort of documentation of what's really, boots on the ground level documentation of what's happening in the farmland markets, as well as with NACRE for the National Council of Real Estate Investment Fiduciaries, which has the largest and probably most frequently referred to indexing system for farmland returns in the U.S. now. So any aspect of the farmland market, we try to remain current on, understand what the implications might be, and help provide what we think of as unbiased and without an agenda information that might help either understand or make decisions.
Oh, that's great. And how can farmers effectively use this data and research to optimize their operations?
So we have some seasonal items, for example, around crop insurance sign-up season. We have a large scale program that you could go essentially pre-quote your own crop insurance and select products that might make the most sense, or evaluate how it might impact your bottom line if different outcomes occur, different prices and weather outcomes, for example. Or you're negotiating a new lease, we'll have lease forms. Or you're wondering how ethanol might affect the demand for corn, we'll have comments on that. So it's really, truly a come to FarmDoc or FarmDoc Daily and kind of search for your topic first. Again, we think of it as decision-centric rather than location-centric information. And again, if there's not something there, email one of us and we'll put it into our agenda because we're always looking for the next day's article.
Oh, very good. And what insights can you share about the current state of the agricultural sector and potential challenges or opportunities for producers?
Yeah, this is, I think it's very cliche, but every moment in time is a unique moment in time. And it's a very interesting moment in time right now because we've come through a 2.5 year total bull market run in land values, had a couple of years of pretty good income. Prior to that, a couple of years of fairly strong payments, from market facilitation payments to CFAP payments and other things, both with the trade war initiated support, other forms of ad hoc payments that came to agricultural sector. And that led to kind of an improved balance sheet by farmers. At the same time, we had extremely low interest rates, primarily because of policy implemented during the pandemic to try to hold interest rates low and spur economic activity. It created kind of a perfect storm for farmland as the major asset class. And again, just some fun stylized facts. Ag as a sector is now crested the $4 trillion mark in the US. So it's an incredibly substantial industry. A lot of folks who aren't involved in agriculture maybe don't appreciate the enormity of it. But only about 2 million farms. And even that number, though, says something that's a little imprecise because about half of them aren't really farms. It's just, a large garden or something that the USDA can count with $1,000 of production.
Right.
So you have this incredible concentration of additional liquidity in a fairly limited market that supported prices. And inflation is generally a positive thing for farmland in the long run. So when the prospects for inflation began to become more apparent, prior to the Fed hiking interest rates, farmland markets started really picking up and really, moving up rather rapidly. Prime agricultural center of the country, farmland values up 25 to 35% in an 18-month period were not uncommon at all. Now we've entered, though, a period of additional uncertainty because of higher interest rates, inflation, a little bit of a recovery in the world trade, a little extra pressure from Brazil in a couple of ways. And I think kind of at a leveling off, I guess, of expectations about future income at some level, a little less promise for ad hoc payments, but still in a very, very healthy state. Agriculture is still in a very, very healthy state. Input prices for the last couple of years, as you know, were through the roof, and those have come back in a little bit on fertility, at least. But I think going forward, it really is a question of what will be the impact of additional spend on greening of energy. So not just ethanol, but locations for wind and solar and sustainable aviation fuel and renewable diesel and things that are adding to the demand side for agriculture, kind of juxtaposed against higher interest rates and recovered stocks. And if the Ukraine-Russia conflict ends sooner than later, maybe there's a restoration of part of the supply side from Ukraine. So I think it's a period of uncertainty that it's always in agriculture. You plant something and then you hope for rain. It's always been an industry that's built around accepting uncertainty. But I think given the forms of monetary uncertainty we have in the US, worldwide uncertainty around trade, it's a little higher than it has been in other parts of my career, at least. And while I'm still fairly optimistic, I would say my confidence interval around my own estimates is a little bit wider than it used to be.
Yeah, great points there. And you mentioned Farm Bill as well. What role do government policies and regulations play in shaping this industry? And how can producers stay informed about these policy changes? And if they don't care about Farm Bill, why should they?
Yeah, these are great. These are great questions. And I didn't realize we had 8 hours to talk about these things.
Right.
That's about how long it would take. To summarize them, I think it's important to recognize there are few primary forms of government participation in agriculture. And the one I'd start with, from my perspective, would be crop insurance. And crop insurance has expanded and evolved and become an absolutely critical cornerstone in risk management for farmers. It provides a revenue protection in many cases that many other industries don't have, frankly, but in lieu of, at least intentionally in lieu of, other forms of ad hoc or disaster assistance. So again, given our earlier conversation, you might think of something like a hurricane where you have FEMA issues or insurance issues and disaster declarations that provide certain kinds of support by region. Agriculture, by and large, doesn't have that. They have crop insurance. And so there are still regional disasters, and don't mean to trivialize that, but crop insurance provides a remarkably consistent support system paid for by the farmers, subsidized by the government, but allows farmers to make long-term plans on something that may have a high degree of short-term systemically critical risk. A second title in the Farm Bill is the conservation title. And the conservation title affects more things than people sometimes understand. So some issues related to management practices and, in the news now would be things like cover crop usage, CRP, historically other forms of limitations in production, but kind of an allocation of funds around what we produce, how we produce, and what the impacts on environmental and other situations might be. So that's, again, they're roughly equal scale, actually, to the expenditures from crop insurance, but a little less obvious because it's not like you make that decision every single year and have to have reporting every single year on it. There are also credit titles in the Farm Bill. Farm credit system, while not being specifically an element of the Farm Bill, is also federally sponsored to some degree, GSE, system of lending, a cooperative system of lending to farmers that people in agriculture are completely comfortable with and know what it is, but a lot of folks wouldn't recognize that it's actually organized outside the laws of banking in the US. and regulated separately. So there are those kinds of issues in the Farm Bill. By far, though, in terms of dollars, the largest portion of the Farm Bill is in supplemental nutrition assistance programs, or SNAP. We think of those as food stamp related, to use the historic colloquialisms, programs, WIC programs, but nutrition support programs. And that has a couple of effects. One, it's a source of demand for agricultural products. If you have food demand, the flow through effects of having that to the agricultural sector are supportive. And secondly, it's a social safety net program that also, very broad participation in certain rural areas and certain parts of inner cities as well. So I think that is sometimes overlooked as being such a critically large part of the Farm Bill. But that's it. So how do you find out, was part of your question, about what's going on in the debate?
Yeah. How to make sense of it, right? There's a lot.
I've tried for 33 years now and have yet to find the secret unlocking key to the puzzles, because the debates tend to be publicized in headlines, but decided in private. And so programs that can generate a lot of appeal could be promoted. Cover crop usage as an example, while the final decision on how to support it quite often has to be cut with budget considerations and trade-offs and negotiations that you would never expect to see the light of day. I don't think there's a magic way to do it, other than there are ag news agencies and ag news organizations and things like you do, and helping people stay informed. I think that topical access to the current information, 4 or 5 news organizations that focus on agriculture as well. I think that's what you just have to do within the cadence of the repeat of the Farm Bill.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And you touched on the big factors influencing farmland prices in the last 3 years. What about regional issues? Do you have any insight on that?
Well, I think agriculture has the uniqueness that where you are also largely determines what you produce. If you're in the Corn Belt, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Ohio, southern Minnesota, you're likely to have access to corn and soybeans, and that's because it's well suited. The economic decisions that have led to the structure of agriculture by millions of people over dozens of years have led to pretty good decisions. You're going to grow almonds and pistachios in one particular region in California. You're going to have apples predominantly in Washington. Citrus has kind of left Florida, both because of weather and because of HLB, or greening. And so you end up with these regionalized markets for agriculture. The Delta, likewise, a very unique area in the U.S. So Southern California, of course, is very driven by water considerations at the moment. The Pacific Northwest is very driven by access to certain export markets and demand for things that are highly interchangeable for production flexibility. Grapes in California were subject to smoke paint from the wildfires. We had dairy is concentrated in about 4 major parts of the U.S. And when milk prices get too low and you end up with, kicking in a essentially milk marketing order has a limitation on price, and then there's an insurance program, you end up with responses that are very regional. I think that's just simply the reality. What's interesting, though, I think more than interesting, what's fascinating and important to also recognize, though, is that the performance of agriculture in a long-term sense has been remarkable. It's the only industry that, I don't have the exact quote to cite, but Secretary Vilsack made the quote in a way that was very kind of ingrained in my mind anyhow. It said, agriculture in the last 50 years now produces twice as much output with half as many inputs, or some such ratio like that. But the productivity gains in agriculture have been remarkable. And in feeding a growing population where the demands for environmental services and energy crops on top of that were layered with, increasingly, as society probably expects, deserves, and wants, different kinds of reporting and regulatory frameworks, identity preservation in food grade, for example, and things like that. I think it's nothing short of an absolute miraculous thing that most of us can't even tell you how much we spend on food as a percentage of our income. So as a great success, not being hungry and having the most plentiful, cheapest food supply in the world and of history is an incredible gain. And as a financial asset, agriculture turns out to have done extremely well also. So long-term returns to agricultural investments are as good as investing in the equity markets or S&P 500, for example.
Yeah, that's an excellent overview. And can you share any insight or predictions on how geopolitical and economic factors, such as trade policies, inflation, global wars, all of that stuff, could impact the future value of farmland? Is it looking positive right now?
Well, this is that's a more than a $64,000 question, literally and figuratively. It's increasingly clear that the world population doesn't move around much. I just had this conversation this morning, in fact, with a group. If you took a map of where people live on the planet 50 years ago, today, and as projected 50 years from now, it looks exactly the same. It's just the scale is a little different. Instead of each dot represents 20,000 people, each dot now represents 30,000 and then 40,000. So we're going to live in very fixed locations. Secondly, the parts of the planet, the sort of surface or terrestrial places where we can grow things, those are very fixed. Soils are not getting up and moving around. So we have to grow things where we grow things, and we're going to consume them where people live. The water resources and the soils don't overlap perfectly well. And when you get to that reality of realizing that you're going to grow the world's food on a very small fraction of the world's surface, and the rest of it is going to be a function of trade. How do we get food where it's consumed? What are the standard of living demands that result in trade and result in the value of a bushel of corn in, say, Western Africa as opposed to Northern Europe? Because you had to grow it somewhere else. Those kind of questions impact and actually determine a lot of where the future values reside in farmland values. So I think the long-term thesis is unchanged, and that is to meet the food, energy, and increasingly environmental needs of a growing population. Agriculture will not shrink in importance, even if it shrinks in terms of its visibility because it succeeds. So again, I think it's a great thing to not know how much you spend on your food budget. People ask me how much you spend on food, and I can say, well, this many dollars. What fraction of your income is that? I don't know. Kind of a small fraction, right? If you ask somebody in a really poor, like emerging economy, what share of their income they spend on food, the answer is all we can, right? So as we kind of increasingly move from as populations emerge from poverty, I should just say it more directly, the demand for higher quality diets goes up. We eat more meat, we eat more cheese and dairy, we eat more things that take more calories at the beginning of the system to come out of the other side where we can use them for human consumption. And likewise, the greening of the energy complex, if you will, not just solar and not just wind, but the idea of keeping more CO2 in the planet longer by having cover crops and more trees and other green areas or improve photosynthetic plants. All of these things are coming, and those are all positive in some sense for the demand for agricultural production factors. And land, again, I mentioned a $4 trillion total for the ag sector. 84 to 85% of that is in farmland. So if in the long term, I think the hypothesis is very strong. The thesis for the demand is very strong for farmland in the long run. Predicting next year is a little harder, right? So as inflation becomes more certain and we learn a bit more about the response of fixed factors of production to price level, nominal price level, eventually wherever it settles in, we'll know whether there's going to be a continued uptick in farmland values or not. But I think still the long term, my long term crystal ball is pretty good, but it's not a hard projection to make, right? So
yeah,
I think it's a very positive long term story nonetheless.
That's good. And what about thinking in the last few decades, there have been fewer there's becoming fewer farms, less farmers, right? As the last generation is selling, and a lot of the kids don't want to run the farm. So there's bigger farms, fewer farmers. How can producers prepare for these potential changes and this trend going forward?
That's again, you've come up with the list of questions I'd like to convert to a class next year here at the U of I. The natural consolidation of farms driven both by economies of scale. So you can produce more efficiently if you run the same equipment over more acres, for example, or there are other reasons where on-farm storage begins to make sense at a certain scale, and technology generally. Also, the accumulation of specialization and family farms have gotten larger. So all of those forces and factors that are driven by the basic economics of the system are going to continue. And the farm sizes will get larger. We have, at the same time, a public narrative and to some degree a policy that says we value smaller, more diverse, widely distributed ownership of agricultural assets. Neither good nor bad in either case on their own. But the factors that are leading to that on the economic side, and then, as you pointed out, the generational turnover means that it's harder and harder to start from scratch. Yeah. It'd be like me saying, I really, pick a topic. I love tennis shoes, so I'm going to start a tennis shoe company. Well, I'm not going to compete with Adidas and Nike. Well, 50 or 100 years ago, saying I want to start a farm was a different thing than now saying I need $20 million to buy land and equipment and then rent 60% with an operating line to get to the scale where I can compete economically. So part of it is the natural evolution of an economic system as it gets larger and more efficient. The aging is often cited of American farmland owners, and a large fraction is owned by people in their 60s and 70s. But the number of operators per farm has actually gone up. So instead of being mom or mom and dad, or dad and son, or mom and son, or family kids, or whatever, it's become a bit more formalized that larger operations have multiple operators, quite often from the same family, sometimes not. And so it's just like the development of industrialized industries in most cases lead to different forms of ownership. That's happened in agriculture. The other thing you mentioned, though, is really fascinating. The heirs and first generation and second generation and third generation. And by the time great-great-grandmother's farm is held by 28 first cousins and second cousins and third cousins, it may not be a very efficient form of ownership. And so we do see increasingly an investment group, owners of farmland, that are a little more distant from, I can't remember who I heard say this first, maybe Paul Pittman, CEO of FPI, might have said this first. It says, if you can't remember having Thanksgiving dinner at your grandmother's table, you probably don't care about owning the farm. And so I think there is that path of farmland ownership that somehow kind of ends when you don't have direct relationship to the asset. And that's different than, say, inheriting shares of JP Morgan, where you might view it as a simple asset interchangeable with any other form of money. So I think that will also continue to lead to opportunities for consolidation. Also, again, reasonably well known in the Midwest, but 60% of farmland is not owned by the person who farms it. So again, it's just a reality. And we tend at the same time, though, to have a somewhat romanticized version of agriculture in most of our minds about a farm being, a small family with 2 chickens, a cow, and a pony. I don't know. That just isn't the case, but we still organize a lot of our policy around the idea of maintaining a highly distinct and very widely distributed ownership.
Yeah, and bringing up the land ownership in the West, I know that the Bureau of Land Management has just come out with some pretty controversial verbiage in their new rules. Do you have any opinions on that?
No, and No, I actually don't. I think in general, the debate about how and who can and what should be done on land is settled both in a public sense and in a private sense. And they'll sometimes compete, sometimes they don't. And WOTUS and other issues related to how we regulate at a level above the level of ownership, what can happen when a resource is used or more broadly shared. These are the things you're mentioning, right? Like the development of law and regulation that changes through time. I think the tone around these debates has become less civil in some sense, and I think the demands,
highly divided for sure.
And that's a better term, highly divided, and folks with a particular point of advocacy quite often come in conflict with people who have a different view or use of that resource. And I think that's probably the best way to stop short of taking a position.
Right.
I think this comes all the way down to like pesticide use on individual farms, though, or can an individual influence an entire industry? As an example, way back, the Alar scare with Meryl Streep, when Alar wasn't even really widely used at the time, and yet it influenced a large number of people. Or actors now, quite often taking a particular position in a debate around environmental policy, for example, tend to have outsized influence relative to a regular voting process. So I think those are things to know about and pay attention to and keep in mind. And I think the impact on agriculture is only likely to increase. We have very strong emotions about confined animal facilities, and very strong emotions about protecting waterways, and very strong emotions about how to know whether food was produced with certain practices and preferences for organic or not, or GMO or not. And all of those things can work themselves out in rational economic and government systems. I think when they conflict and end up with headlines, it usually, hardly ever ends with the first headline.
Yeah, well said. So what are some of the opportunities that you think growers should be embracing 2023 and beyond?
So personally, I have, small shares of interest in farms, and I tried very intentionally to get some exposure to different parts of the country. So I have to think about that question. I don't feel like I should be entitled to teach students if I don't have a little skin in the game myself. And so I think the technology around agricultural production, and I want to be very clear about this. I don't think we're about to have some remarkable breakthrough, forever changing set of instant technologies, even though ag tech and agribusiness around ag tech has really had a lot of remarkable improvements. Auto steer in tractors, for example, and the improvements in genetics and the ability to do things with very safe herbicides compared to even 20 years ago. Those are things that are literally world changing. And the wheat breeding program, Norm Borlaug, may have saved 1 billion people. Who knows? So these are all things that I think embracing rather than objecting to and experimenting need to be part of a producer's at least openness of mind. Excuse me. But I'm not looking for like the magic silver bullet that's going to make my corn yield 600 bushels and that's not what I'm looking for. But I think the slow evolution of technology in agriculture has been absolutely astounding. Genetics in particular. We grow corn in parts of the country now where we never thought it was possible. And we grow more bushels of everything than could have ever been possible without the advances in genetics and breeding that have happened. So, excuse me, the access to information that we have now at our fingertips as well is likewise game changer. To be able to carry around in your pocket a device that you can essentially access all the world's information and now ask an AI or a generative AI system to even make decisions with and for you. I think those are changing. What I'd say, though, on the backside of that is it's incremental and we never notice when it happens. So I have a kind of a common little icebreaker at talks that I sometimes get where I say, everyone, please take out your cell phone and put it face down. And everybody thinks I'm trying to keep them from, texting or doing emails when I say that. And I'm not. the next question is, now take out your camera. And now take out the device on which you keep your calendar appointments. Now take out the device on which you listen to music, and now take out your atlas or maps. And I go through and now take out your credit card banking systems. And at the end, you have 11 historically separate devices that are now in the thing we call a phone, and yet we hardly ever make a call on them. So I think technology in agriculture is doing the same thing. We're collapsing the inefficiencies and they go away and we don't really notice it. And so what about the fact that I now have the ability to use a drone that I'm not even on my farm to find out if there's pest pressure? It's remarkable. What if I do acreage reporting now in an automated fashion while I was scouting? That's remarkable. What if I have auto steer now that can keep my rows within 3 inches and automatically shut off one arm of the planter as I'm going through point rows and never double plant? That's actually remarkable. So I think that, and customizing the nutrient like cocktail that we feed our plants at the right moments in time, we're doing something that my grandparents would have never even recognized as farming. So I think those are the opportunities to just keep being open to the change, being able to adapt. The energy payment system that a lot of people were expecting to be paid for carbon, paid for their information, paid for something. I don't know how that will materialize, but I do recognize that generation of wind and solar in particular, and the use of the surface area of the earth to grow green things, to have a carbon capture, certainly favor agricultural regions and being able to, think through those opportunities. I'm not a proponent or an opponent, just saying being aware that that's going to be a change source of demand for use of land is an important part of the future as well.
Yeah, those are all great points and remarkable. I like the way that you laid that out about the phone. It's so true. That's everything, right? You lose your phone and you can't do anything. It feels very vulnerable.
Well, again, as a personal moment that I realized is, I have a daughter who just graduated from the university, and she and her friends went on a trip to Europe, and her phone was stolen. And a very organized little system that grabbed things, and with it a credit card. And historically, to me, I would have said, "Oh no, my credit card's gone. What do I do? How do I do this?" And to her generation, the question was, "Oh, all my records are there in my pictures. I hope I have them in the cloud."
Yeah.
And so the use of that to organize your life, I had to kind of like deal with in a very real, literal sense. And the reality of what you just said is it does contain a link to everything. It's an extension of what we are now. So, and in agriculture, I think the genetics and agronomics are kind of that. If you don't get that right, nothing else matters. Mm-hmm. But there's a element where the weather, in almost every case, a little different with livestock, but the weather in almost every case is the one thing that remains uncontrollable. So mitigating risk around the edge of that requires even more diligence with those other tools you do have.
Yeah, that's excellent. And you, as I mentioned at the beginning, you're going to be at the Women in Agribusiness Summit in Nashville this year in September. Tell us about what you're going to be talking about there. So
the most fun thing for me is, and again, it's probably only to me, but to be able to document and understand what has happened in agricultural markets. And I have a really fun history because I've been doing this for so long. I've been at the university over 30 years now. And the history that's been built up is just filled with these great examples of saying where we're headed and where we're going and how to make connections. At the same time, in the last 15 years or so, I've become increasingly engaged with ag tech. And so being able to make an investment in agriculture or being adjacent to it in the technology that's facilitating something in agriculture has become less distinguishable than it used to be. It used to be we had ag tech or agribusiness or production agriculture. And the Venn diagrams are just slowly collapsing on top of each other.
Yeah.
So if you were to look at, say, a seed breeder they now have to know a whole lot more about how the seed is actually going to be planted and what the conditions are, and then interact with the folks who are doing the seed coatings. We're then interacting with the consumer packaged goods company that's buying the tomatoes to make sure they're, connected in the right certification system for the inputs connected to, and it's just become kind of a orbits around each other that are converging. And so I want to try to make the case for what in agriculture is still investable, how those are changing, the role of agribusiness on the side, where ag tech and agribusiness are in fact overlapping and where they're not. And it generally is a fun conversation. It's really, when you take a little closer look at, pun intended, you peel your own onion back a bit and find out that the industry that you're in has a lot of other layers. I think it's one of the most fun learning moments possible.
For sure. And so will you be sharing some of that in your
Yes.
speech as well there? Yes. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. I can't wait to hear it. I will be there. So hopefully I get to meet you there too.
Looking forward to seeing you in person. Oh.
Yes. Yeah. So I have one last question for you. Why do you serve this industry? What are you most passionate about in all of this?
Oh gosh. I'm the luckiest guy that I know in terms of accidentally having the best possible career in terms of matching interest with opportunity. I grew up on a farm, and I didn't know how lucky I was to have that experimental and laboratory-like environment growing up. My dad in particular was very much a never say no kind of guy. If I wanted to try something, try it. Let's see if it works, learn from it, but document it, keep track of it, find out if you made money, find out if you lost money, decide why. And that curiosity, I think, led to a lot of things that I'm very lucky to have stumbled into. I didn't, when I was 18, have a view that I was going to be a farmer or not, or be in agriculture or not. Go to college, and I didn't have a view of that. Went to grad school, didn't think I'd have a view of that, and literally took the position I now have thinking it was going to be a temporary way to learn a little bit more. And how lucky could I be to have landed at one of the top research institutions in the country with an unbelievably supportive team, bunch of colleagues that you couldn't replicate. I can't think of replicating anywhere else. Tremendous interest in commercial agriculture and an absolutely deep and ingrained view of the importance of food and agribusiness. But I think my North Star, though, is the economic efficiency of the production system. Wow. And if you can make food cheaper, more plentiful with doing less to the possible future production of those same things, then I think that's a pretty good outcome. And I think it's allowed me to stay fairly immune to political positions. I don't have to take a stance on whether a rule about water is good or bad. I can say, what's the impact on food? What's the impact on a world production? What's the impact on trade? Will there be more or less people starving in the world? And that sort of North Star of cheap, safe food all lands on farmland. So again, it's just totally incredibly lucky to have fallen into that career path, and wish I had another 35 years to keep doing it. So.
Right. Yeah. That's a refreshing viewpoint too. I like that. No anger or derision. This is the way it is. How is it going to impact? Right. Let's take out the balance. I like that outlook. I think a lot more people need to embrace that outlook.
I like the way you just rephrased it, because it was more articulate than what I said, actually. But it's a difference between, being, and I heard this from somebody who's interviewing here to go to grad school, something along the lines of taking passionately held positions is different than asking questions passionately.
Right.
Or advocating for something without knowing what the consequence is isn't actually advocating for anything. Mm-hmm. So I think the goal of education in particular is to help people think about how their decisions and questions have a connection to the next phase. Everything continues on in time, and everything is likely to have a connection that's greater than the first stage decision you make.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Bruce. What a great conversation. And I hope you'll join me again at some point.
Thank you very much. I greatly enjoyed it. I appreciate all that you're doing.
Yeah. Thank you. And thanks to all who are watching or listening. If you want to learn more, links are provided in the show notes. And don't forget to subscribe to North American Ag Spotlight on YouTube, Rumble, or Telegram channels. And the podcast is available on Spotify, Apple, Amazon, Listen Notes, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you like this episode, I'd love it if you shared it. And have a great day. Our newest podcast by North American Ag is called What Color is Your Tractor? The stories behind the ag brands you love and the ag brands you love to hate. Hosted by me, Chrissy Wozniak. We take a deep dive into the companies that have built modern agriculture. Subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform. Go to whatcolorisyourtractor.com. Available on Apple, Amazon, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts.